Hi, this is Paramdeep from Pristine, and in this session, we'll create a small integrated model. Is that okay? So, this is like a first step in creating an integrated model. So, the problem statement is given, the financial numbers I'll just show you, and post that, we'll attempt to create the first integrated model, right? So, I give you 1 minute to take a look at the statement. You can pause the recording and take a look at the statement. So what does this statement say? It essentially says that we are looking at a startup company, right? And the company would be eligible for funding. So I'm looking for a VC funding for the company, right? So I want to figure out whether the company would be eligible for VC funding or not, right? This is just an eligibility criteria. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition to get the money, right? So I'm looking at an eligibility criteria. So the company would be eligible for funding if its average operating profit margin over the 5-year period is greater than 35%, right? So I'm looking at an average operating profit margin. Average of the operating profit margin for the last 5 years to be greater than 35%, right? And I'm looking at the CAGR of the revenue growth. Now, typically what happens in startup companies is that they try to undercut the competition, and to undercut the competition, their prices do not reflect the real prices that should be there in the market. So most of the startup companies are more concerned about the revenue growth rather than the profit growth. But still, the VCs are interested in figuring out whether they are making some profit out of the operations of the company or not, right? So this is the first condition that they are looking for. The important point to note here is the and. So, and the second condition that they are looking for is that the CAGR, the cumulative annual growth rate, or the compounded annual growth rate for the 5 years, should be greater than 50%. Is that okay? So we want to create a model and check if the company is eligible for funding or not. Is that okay? And we have to visually indicate the eligibility. Is that okay? So these are the two conditions that we are concerned about, right? So I do hope that you are clear on the problem statement at least. So let me show you the financials of the company. So these are the financials of the company. The company has been making growth of from 100,000 US dollars. It has gone to 340,000 US dollars, and this is how the costs of the company have moved. Is that okay? So, so this is primarily what I want to check against, right? So let's first of all calculate the total operating costs. Now, one of the focuses of this particular session would be to move away from the usage of mouse and use your keyboard as much as possible. Is that okay? So I want to calculate the total operating costs. So total operating cost is sum of all the operating costs. Now, since these are contiguous cells, so we can use a shortcut called odd equal to that calculates the sum of all the operating costs. Control C and enter or paste Control V. So these are total operating costs of the company. I want to calculate the operating profit margin. So first of all, I want to calculate the operating profit, and then I want to calculate the operating profit margin. So I want 2 rows. To select a row, shortcut is Shift Spacebar. Shift down to select 2 rows. To insert 2 rows, use Alt I and then R. Just insert 2 rows for you. Now within the 2 rows, I want to calculate the total operating profit. Then I want to calculate the operating profit margin. Is that okay? Out here I will calculate the average operating profit margin. Yeah. So what is the total operating profit? This is equal to your revenues minus the operating costs. Please note that I'm not using the mouse. To do that, I just start with an equal to. I point to the revenues using my keyboard minus the total operating costs. Is that okay? So Control C, Shift right and enter, or Control V. Is that okay? Control C to copy, Control V to paste. So if you press F2, you can see that the references have moved correctly. So operating profit margin for the first year is total operating profit divided by the revenue. Control C, shift right, right, right. Now this is shown as 0101. It is not a percentage. So to convert it into percentage, shortcut is Control Shift 5. Is that okay? Shortcut is Control Shift 5. Is that okay? So what is the average operating profit margin? The average operating profit margin equal to AVE RAGE. To complete this formula, tab key. Now take your cursor using your keyboard to this one. Then Control Shift right. This calculates sort of selects the full cells, complete, and this is the average operating profit margin that you are getting. Is that okay? So this calculates the average operating profit margin for you. Now I want to calculate the CAGR in the revenue, the compounded annual growth rate in the revenue. Now to calculate the compounded annual growth rate, the first thing that we need to do is understand what compounded annual growth rate is, right? So before getting into that, let me first try to show you what compounded annual growth rate is, right? So let's take a very simple example from banking, right? So if I've invested, let's say, if I've invested my principal in a bank, right, for let's say n number of years. So this is the principal that I invest in a bank. So let's say the principal P right now, it could be 100. I have an interest rate of let's say 10% compounded annually. Is that okay? This is compounded annually. Is that okay? And let's say I invested for 2 years. So my time period is 2 years. Is that okay? So we can take these RT as generalized numbers later on, right? So what would be my amount after 2 years? So my amount in 2 years would essentially be equal to my principal, which was 100. After the first year, the value would be 100 multiplied by 1 plus 10%. And after the second year, the value would be still multiplied by 1 plus 10%. So it would be still 1 plus 10%. Is that okay? So this is going to be the value after 2 years. Is that okay? So this is going to be 100 multiplied by 1 plus 10% squared. Is that okay? If I try to generalize this formula, then the value after n years, right, the amount or the value after n years is equal to the value in the beginning. Is that okay? The value in the beginning multiplied by 1 plus r. This is the compounded annual growth rate. This r is called the compounded annual growth rate raised to the power n. Is that okay? So this is the generalized formula that is there. So this is my principal, this is my amount, and this is my principal. So from here, if I want to get r, what would that be? So I can say that 1 plus r raised to the power n is equal to the value after n years divided by the value after the value in the first year. So out here, this implies that my 1 plus r, the 1 plus CAGR is equal to value in the nth year divided by value in the first year raised to power 1 by n. So this implies that the CAGR, the compounded annual growth rate, is basically Vn divided by V1 raised to the power 1 by n minus 1. So when I want to calculate the compounded annual growth rate for my company for the revenues, right, it is going to be equal to Vn. So my Vn is actually this is my revenue in the 5th year divided by revenue in the first year, right, raised to the power a total number of years. This is 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years. So in totality, there are actually 4 years in which the company is growing. So 1 by 4 minus 1. Is that okay? So the only formula that I used is this CAGR formula. Okay, to control this into percentage, shift control 5. Is that okay? So these are the average operating profit margin and the CAGR in the revenue. Now I want to put in my assumptions for eligibility. So let's introduce 3 rows here, alt I and then R. So I want to put in my eligibility criteria. Yeah. So for eligibility criteria, I have these 2 criteria. So let's take these two criteria. I want my average operating profit margin to be, just 1 second. I want my average operating profit margin to be greater than 35% and CAGR to be greater than 50%. So I'm looking for a 35% CAGR, average operating profit margin, and 50% CAGR. Is that okay? Now I want to see whether the company is going to be eligible or not. So these are again assumptions that I have. So I can again put them in a blue colored font, right? So if you see, my eligibility criteria has a and in there, right? So it has this and in there. So just hold on 1 second. So it has this and in there, right? So I want both these conditions to be satisfied. Is that okay? So obviously in Excel you can put the and condition. So I start with an equal to, and I want my average profit operating profit margin greater than the 35% that I am looking at, and I want the CAGR to be greater than the assumptions that I have made, right? So if both these are greater than 35% and 50%, both these conditions should be satisfied, then I would be eligible for funding. So this gives a false, which essentially means that I am not eligible for funding. Is that okay? So, but false and true do not give you the real picture of what's going to happen. So we should convert this false into, let's say, eligible, or let's say a yes or a no. So what I want is, if this is equal to true, you need not put this is equal to true also, but just for simplicity's sake I'm doing that. Then say yes, it's eligible for funding, else say no, not eligible for funding. Is that okay? So I have now changed this false to, let's say, yes or a no. Now if the assumption for CAGR, let's say, changes to 25%, then I would be eligible for funding, right? So I'm saying yes, I am eligible for funding, right? Now what I want to essentially do is that I want to change this. Yes, I want to visually represent this. I want to visually indicate, right, whether I am eligible for funding or not. So I essentially want that if it is yes, it should show in a green color. If it is no, it should show in a red colored font. So for that, what we can do is we can use the conditional formatting in Excel. Just click on conditional formatting, go to highlight cell rules. Okay, if this is equal to, let's say, yes, then let's put a green colored font there, right, and say okay. And again click on conditional formatting, go to highlight cell rules, go to equal to. If this is equal to no, then let's fill it with a red colored font. Is that okay? So now let's say if we change one of these assumptions, let's say if the revenue is not able to grow to 340, but let's say it is able to grow to 200 only, then I am not eligible for funding, right? Or let's say if my CAGR requirement is actually 50% now, then I am still not eligible for funding. So out here, let's say if my revenue reaches 500, I'm still not. If my revenue reaches 10,000, then I am eligible for funding, right? So this is typically how a financial model is created. Yeah. So some things that you need to remember while creating the financial model is to make sure that sort of your information is structured, so that whoever is taking a look at the information is able to clearly make out what's happening where. So for example, I have a separate section for my eligibility criteria. I have a separate section for my revenues and the operating costs, that are basically the assumptions that I have made. I have a separate section to calculate whether the company is eligible for funding or not. Again, I have a visual view of if the company is eligible for funding, then I'm showing it as yes. If it's not, then I'm showing it as no. And whatever are the assumptions that I have made, I put them in a blue colored font, so that if you want to change these assumptions, you can change, right? So sort of this eases out things for you a little bit. So this is typically how integrated financial models are created. One thing to note is that if I change any assumption, everything else in the model just falls into place, right? So we need to make sure that none of the parts in the calculations are put as constants, but they're always linked to the model, right? I do hope that you found the tutorial to be useful. As I told you, this is the first step that you have taken in creating a model. So I do suggest that you take a deeper look into it, because if you know this, then getting into the main model would be much easier. And if you don't understand this, then things would be a little more difficult than what they than what they usually appear to be, right? If you have any questions, feel free to send an email to me on paramdeep@edupristine.com, or you could give me a call on +91 989 298 0608, right? I'll be more than happy to answer whatever queries you have, right? I do hope that you found the tutorial to be useful. If you have any questions, feel free to get back to me. Thank you.